Foolery, sir, does walk about the orb like the sun. It shines everywhere. William Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, Act 3, Scene 1. Homo sapiens, as inherently social creatures, have a variety of roles to fill in their tribe. Elder women, those who had survived childbirth and had learnt which local plants were best used as a medicament, considering their inherent knowledge of female anatomy, would often become midwives and healers. The most physically gifted of the males will be expected to defend their tribe from aggressors or hunts, whilst overwhelmingly depending on the many men and women who would instead gather food, the overwhelming producer of their community's calorific intake. From Neolithic caves to Elizabethan theatres, from Han Dynasty China to Dark Age Europe, there has been an archetype that naturally forms in our societies with seemingly no evolutionary benefit. A trade that began the first time we told an embellished story around a campfire and still exists today as a multi-billion-dollar industry that continues to influence our consciousnesses. Something that differs us from every other living being in our ability to recount, create, satirise and imagine. This is of course the jester, the bard, the entertainer. The oldest example of what we could perceive as entertainment are prehistoric cave paintings, the oldest of which depicts 3 wild pigs painted with ochre in a newly rediscovered cave on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. This art, dated over 45,000 years ago, could have many possible reasons for its creation. Anthropologists theorise that humans have a necessity to cultivate our surroundings. This need stems from our evolutionary predilection for subsistence farming. Thousands of years ago, we would have collected the most appeasing fruits, vegetables and herbs, the discarded seeds of which would ultimately begin to grow in proximity to our dwellings. Upon noticing these favoured plants, we would aid their survival against less appealing sustenance. Humans that didn't act upon this fortunate byproduct would be less likely to survive, breed, and therefore pass on their DNA. The humans that were inherently more motivated to cultivate land would pass this predilection on to their offspring, compounding this desire, and in doing so would set a course for humanity to inherently desire to alter our environment on an agricultural and aesthetic level. There are theories that the paintings mentioned would serve as a visual signifier of the local hunting opportunities, but personally I find this lacks merit. Why would an archaic human wish to share information to an outsider that the area was abundant in edible game, for this would only attract rivals of that finite calorific intake? Also, if this art was meant as a communicator, why paint it so deeply in a cave that can go lost for 45,000 years? Ultimately, I feel the reason why this art was created is for purely indulgent reasons. Yes, the motivation comes from a subconscious bias to alter our surroundings, but the real reason is because creating and expressing ourselves brings enjoyment. This is where the concept of the oral tradition or oral history plays a part. This is the act of preserving cultural and historical information in the collective human consciousness by way of vocal utterance. With our natural predilection for pattern recognition, or more importantly, what does not fit a part of that pattern, as a species we would forget the bland elements of a story and instead be biased towards the more fantastical and visually compelling parts. These stories, over time, would evolve from being the story of how we migrated to our lands, to instead the wild battles of mystical gods. It seems that embellishment and a compelling narrative are coded into our DNA, and in that is fiction and fantasy. This also leans into another survival tool human beings have cultivated, and that is the use of gossip. It is easy to perceive gossip as something solely plastered on the front of tabloid magazines or the idle chatter of parents at the school gates, but gossip is an incredibly important tool for the Homo sapien. This overzealous information sharing would again go through the process I just mentioned, where inconsequential details would quickly be forgotten in contrast to the more explosive topics. This information would then again be shared until it was common knowledge, and the subject of these rumours would be either lionised or demonised accordingly. This information would not only be about the best new bush to find berries, but would also be about the personalities and actions of those of whom humans shared their camp with. Early humans would inherently know their actions would be judged in the public eye, and thus treated their fellow campmates with the respect they wished to be treated. It should also be said that those with a particular skill in oration would be able to embellish and cultivate the story in a particular light, may be painting the scenario in a particular shade other than one that is more accurate to the truth. The first recorded reference of those employed as entertainers is in the 5th dynasty of Egypt, 25th century BCE. These majestic pharaohs of ancient Egypt would import pygmy people from the lands we now know as South Sudan and its surrounding neighbours. The word pygmy refers to an ethnic group of people whose height is unusually short in comparison to the average Homo sapien. Despite this being a term used by the United Nations, most people who fit the definition choose not to embrace it, wanting rather to be referred to as their wider ethnic group's nomenclature. The consent or ethics of these people being transported across the Sahara to entertain a foreign king is unknown. It appears they were mainly used as entertainers, dancers, and essentially a spectacle, considering the difference in their size and ethnic origin to their audience. Pharaoh Neferkiri, during Egypt's 6th dynasty, wrote in a letter to an official upon reading that he had found the pharaoh a dancing dwarf, saying, "Come northward to the court immediately. Thou shalt bring this dwarf with thee, to rejoice and gladden the heart of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Neferiki, who lives forever." Sadly, those with dwarfism were continually fetishized throughout ancient Egypt and the Roman Empire, well up into the Elizabethan age. This is where the archetype begins to reveal itself. It is no coincidence that people with dwarfism were specifically selected as entertainers, as to be an entertainer is to inherently view society from an isolated, outer perspective, just as someone with dwarfism will be viewed by the majority of society. This perspective is not only physical, in the sense that on a stage, one is the minority being perceived by the majority, but also as a craftsperson, one would constantly witness the mechanisms of entertainment and spectacle, and eventually learn the underlying processes as a boat pilot would a river. The paradox of being an object of attention and admiration, yet simultaneously holding little socio-economic power, is something we should continue to contemplate moving forward. This seems like a pertinent time to mention the two main groups court entertainers have historically been divided into, this being natural and artificial fools. Natural fools were to be laughed at, having a perceived natural deficiency, whether this was intellect or stature, like our Sudanese friends I just mentioned. Rather than being seen as the inhumane practice it was, instead this was often perceived as a positive, as these people would struggle to earn a living elsewhere because of their perceived disability. Artificial fools, on the other hand, were supposed to create entertainment intentionally, as opposed to the unintentional, natural fools. They were expected to play music, dance, and deliver witty satire at the courts. Ancient China is said to have employed professional entertainers in the service of King Zhuang of Chu in the 6th century BCE. Yu Meng is considered China's first entertainer. The prefix Yu was often followed by Chang for a musician, Ling for foolery, and Pat for humour. Yu Meng was given the rare privilege of his words having immunity and were considered without offence. This paradoxical relationship would later in medieval times be referred to as the jester's privilege. This was a double-edged sword, as he was unable to communicate any grievances earnestly. Instead, he could only communicate to the court via the mediums of jokes, songs, and dances. This genius work by King Zhuang meant any rumour or negative thought delivered to him in front of his court would be by the blunted performance of a jester. Such an act would not only assure everyone that the king was knowledgeable of any disloyal rumours, but would also be a firm reminder of the status quo. China undoubtedly has the longest unbroken tradition of jesters or court entertainers, starting with Yu Meng. The jesters of China are most renowned for their interesting names, such as Twisty Pole, Baldy Chimyu, Moving Bucket, and Newly Polished Mirror. It is recorded that Twisty Pole, a jester of the first emperor Qin Shi Huang, combined both elements of the fool by suffering from dwarfism and having excellent wit. When the emperor wanted to build a game park instead of investing in military matters, Twisty Pole exclaimed, "What a marvellous idea! And then, if there's an invasion, you can just let the gazelles and deer butt the invaders with their horns." This trend for courtly jesters would die out in China at the end of the Han Dynasty in the 1200s. The ancient Greeks enjoyed theatre as one of their leisure activities. Their passion for this art could be considered the bedrock of theatre, with the sock and buskin, two masks featuring expressions of elation and sadness, still being used to decorate theatres to this day. It is said that the Greeks have a special reverence for the spoken word, Less than 10% of the population was considered literate in those times. Because of this, the written word was considered scholarly and intangible, in contrast to the much more practical spoken word. In a very archaic perspective, Socrates believed that once something had been written down, it inherently lost its ability to change and grow, therefore showing the preference for an oral tradition. The state city of Athens institutionalized theatre as part of the Dionysian festival around 700 BCE, with Dionysus being the god of vegetation, fruit, orchards, winemaking, fertility, festivity, insanity, ritual madness, and religious ecstasy. It goes without saying how indulgent these festivals would be. There are three main styles in which the Greeks performed their plays. The first, tragedy, was usually a combination of epic archaic myths passed down via oral tradition and themes contemplating human nature. This is considered the first to be invented and seems to be an evolution of the ancient rites conducted for Dionysus. It is almost uncanny how little the theory of storytelling has evolved. A tragedy would begin with the players explaining the background of the story and what was about to occur, referred as a prologue. There would then be a parados, where the characters would be introduced. The story would then begin to unfold in 3 or more series of episodes or episodes. The tragedy would then be concluded by a section referred to as an exodus. This would later be formalised by Aristotle into the concept of the 3-act structure and further realised in 1949 Common Era in Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey or Theory of the Monomyth. The second was comedy, which mainly consisted of sexual and scatological jokes as well as, in a major contrast, political satire. Aristotle, rather broadly, defined comedy as laughable people involving some kind of blunder or ugliness. This style would be employed to criticise and lampoon public figures and institutions of the time, reflecting a similar purpose that court entertainers had historically done and would continue to do into the medieval and Renaissance period. This would later inspire 18th century philosophers and pamphleteers such as Voltaire and Jonathan Swift, famous for the deadpan, ironic, and modest proposal. Instead of this lampooning being confined to the royal court though, in this case it was performed in giant public amphitheatres. Following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, the subject of comedic theatre changed from satirising public affairs to an exploration of everyday life and the foibles and fears of an average person. As opposed to depictions of well-known public figures, instead, archetypal stock characters began to be introduced. This would include the permissive father figure, the stern father figure, braggarts, parasites, cunning servants, quarrelling couples, young lovers, and kind-hearted prostitutes. The use of these archetypal figures would later inspire Shakespeare in his comedic dramas, to Punch and Judy shows, and even the modern soap opera. The third variant is a satyr play, which is a combination of both the tragedy and comedic plays, and was performed at the end of the Dionysian festivals. In Greek mythology, a satyr is a drunken, lustful, woodland spirit with horse ears, a tail, and a constant exaggerated erection. A more well-known rendition of the satyr is the Roman variant, called a faun, which has the ears and bottom half of a goat. These satyrs would take the place of a chorus that had traditionally been used in Greek theatre. The chorus, in tragedies and comedies, would usually act as narrators and commentators, but in the satyr plays they had a more comedic role to play. The plays would include the grand plots and characters of the tragedies, but would invoke a more comedic tone by utilising the farcical and buffoonish nature of the satyr chorus. A common theme seems to continue throughout this ancient tradition, with the subject matter being the gossip of the ruling elites, combined with the everyday experiences and struggles of the working person, conveyed with the charming yet buffoonish narration of the satyrs. It seems that little has changed from the idle chatter that would have commenced around a prehistoric campfire to the modern-day sitcom. During this performance, the audience were able to ridicule, empathise, and process the collective emotions that they as a society shared. These events would be a moment when they could revel in unsaid truths, just the same as the royal courts of China would, half a world away. Ironically, the performers' acting was unconventionally truthful. The foolish, brutish satyrs delivered deeply intellectual insight. The Dionysian festival, while being a celebration of spring and growth, was at the same time heartfelt, raw honesty and an acceptance of the paradoxical duality of the natural order, that it is cruel but kind, nourishing and also barren. The comedic actors of ancient Rome are most likely the prototype of what we would perceive as the classic medieval European court jester. A ballatro was a comedic actor, very similar to the medieval jester, which would entertain the wealthy at their lavish dinners, as well as the general public during Colosseum games. This role that had begun in the satyr plays evolved from being overwhelmingly buffoonish into a master of ceremonies position. Between the Colosseum's events, the ballatros would amuse the crowds by satirising local gossip and Rome's politics, sometimes accompanied by music or feats of dexterity like juggling. The outspokenness of the ballatros would occasionally overstep the mark apparently, with periodic purges of this entertainer class throughout ancient Rome's history. Because of this, these entertainers would begin migrating to the extremities of Rome's empire, laying the foundations for the medieval jester and the archetype of the travelling bard. This is where I believe the origin of the bardic stereotype, that being a lustful, charismatic cad, truly begins. The lecherous vision of the satyr began to evolve from its beginnings to a debonair travelling artiste. It takes little imagination to visualise an entertainer fleeing the latest of Rome's crackdowns, finding themselves surrounded by the enamoured curiosity of rural folk. Not only would this character be charming, feeling little anxiety performing to the small crowd of an alehouse as opposed to Rome's richest or a Colosseum's roar, but would arrive with the opulent dress, poise, as well as rumours of the metropolis. This tantalising foreigner would of course be a hit with the ladies, posing a stark contrast to the hardy working men they were usually surrounded by. The envy this created would not only elevate the pedestal that charming man was sat upon, and eventually compel the aloof attitude that captivated that transfixed young woman to begin with. As important as a farmer or a blacksmith was in ancient times, and even today, their tools are rather brutish and obvious. This travelling entertainer, who expertly played the cithara and whose vocabulary was precisely inflected, had a more nuanced tool. This was essentially the art of communication and therefore language. To hypothesize, language is the tool we use to interpret the world. Arguably, this tool was invented before both the use of stone and the taming of fire. This tool was not only created to help us navigate the earth, but also our own consciousnesses. This is why this unfamiliar rogue captivated such interest, because they commanded the mechanisms of human emotion. While a farmer's plough or a blacksmith's hammer was evidence, an entertainer's tool was often incorporeal and therefore almost magic. To live this kind of a lifestyle was eerily similar to the court entertainers of ancient Egypt, hundreds of years before. Fair enough, they weren't captured and taken to foreign lands, or belittled for their stature, but they would still be a class separate from the rest of society. Their trade was an indulgence, as opposed to a necessity. Because of this, and their nomadic nature, they were always a spectacle, a stranger, an outsider from the community. They would be idolised in a very literal sense, the centre of attention, but alien simultaneously. As feudalism became the dominant system of rule in medieval Europe, monarchs and nobles would employ entertainers to amuse guests and dignitaries attending their courts. When their responsibilities took them away from their castles, nobles would bring an entourage of servants with different skill sets. This retinue often included servants to conduct domestic chores, men-at-arms to protect them, and finally minstrels, which meant little servant, commonly meaning musicians, singers, jugglers, and tumblers. This only facilitated the occupation of the wandering entertainer even more, as entertainers could be hired along the way, and wealth was no longer consolidated by a single capital city-state, but instead was kept by multiple vassal kingdoms. The artificial fools of this time were, ironically, rather well educated. Monks and university students who were too nonconformist to continue their studying may fall into this profession, being most probably one of the few of court who could in fact read. This would raise them to bizarre heights of responsibility considering their outward appearances, gifting astute political insight, if not still through the medium of farce. Nobles would employ officially licensed fools who were experts in music, storytelling, and physical comedy, as well as acrobatics and juggling. The skill of these people was, amazingly, respected as much as the martial prowess of the lords of court. Entertainers would be taken to battle to inflict what could only be described as psychological warfare on the enemy, mocking them and lifting up the morale of their own army by reciting songs and stories. This is where we see the introduction of the jester's outfit we imagine in our popular cultures. This clothing would be a patchwork of bright colours, mimicking the opulent dress and foreign fabrics of the nobles of courts. This mockery would continue with bells sewn into the clothing, a farcical rendition of the ostentatious tassels found on royal clothing. The jester's cap began its existence emulating donkey ears, a reference to the satyr, and eventually morphed into the variant with two long prongs draping either side, as we can all imagine. Among their professional possessions was a baton, a ridicule of a king's sceptre, with a face carved into it to resemble its owner's. This would be used as the fool's alter ego and comedic partner, saying things that even the jester found too risky, like an archaic ventriloquist's act. All of this would further add to the otherness of this particular frequenter of court. This odd addition, often speaking in riddles, plucking a tune, or cartwheeling along the halls, would bear a stark contrast to the nobles, whose skills were few except martial competence. There are many famous jesters recorded in this era of history around the world. King Henry II of England employed Ronald the Farter as his fool. It takes little imagination to figure what Ronald's entertainment entailed, but he was handsomely rewarded for it, in acres of land and a large Suffolk manor. This entertainment apparently served a second function though, as a philosophical reminder that even the regal king was susceptible to base functions such as this, and therefore sin, like any other living, breathing creature. Stanczak was employed by multiple Polish kings throughout his tenure. Instead of the farcical nature of some of his contemporaries, instead Stanczak was known for his sharp wit and astute philosophical insights. One such insight occurred after an ill-fortuned hunting accident, which involved King Sigismund the Old's wife, Queen Bona, falling from her horse and subsequently having a miscarriage. A bear had recently been released into the woods for the king to hunt, but instead it charged the hunting party, which Stanczak was a part of. When the king asked why Stanczak fled, he stated, "It was a greater folly to let out a bear that was already in a cage." The real meaning of this phrase has been interpreted as commentary on King Sigismund's campaign into Prussia, which he later did not incorporate into Poland's crown lands. Bernal Diaz de Castillo, a Spanish conquistador who visited the Aztec king Moctezuma II in the 1600s, stated that the king had what we would refer to as natural fools as a part of his retinue, saying, "Sometimes some little humpbacked dwarves would be present at his meals, whose bodies seemed almost to be broken in the middle. These were his jesters." Birbal is a legendary figure in Indian history from the 1600s that was closely regarded by his master, the Mughal Emperor Akbar I. Birbal is remembered as being as brave as he was intelligent, with stories that he courageously stood in front of an enraged elephant to protect his emperor, as well as resuscitating him after he fell from his horse during a game of polo. He was once questioned by the chief eunuch of the royal court, who asked, "How many men and women are there in the world?" Birbal claimed he knew the answer, but said he could only be sure if all the eunuchs, whose gender was ambiguous, were killed. This answer apparently deterred the chief eunuch, and enamoured Akbar to his jester even more so. Sir Geoffrey Hudson, or Lord Minimus, was the court dwarf of the English Queen Henrietta Maria of France during this time also. He was gifted to her by the Duchess of Buckingham at 7 years old during a banquet in which he burst out of her pie in a full suit of armour tailored to fit his 18-inch frame. His height is attributed to a deficiency in a growth hormone caused by a pituitary gland disorder, and because of this, he was well proportioned in contrast to others that suffer from achnodroplastia, a genetic disorder whereby the limbs are diminutive. Geoffrey will be the latest addition to the Queen's several natural curiosities, which included a giant Welsh porter by the name of William Evans, a monkey called Pug, and 2 other people of short stature who suffered from achnodroplastia. He was well aware that his place in court was because of his rare appearance, and so leaned into his wit and intelligence and penned a variety of poems and narratives. He went on to lead an incredibly interesting life, where he went on multiple royal missions, one to gain support for the king in the English Civil War. Ships that he sailed on were twice boarded by pirates. The later involved him being taken as a slave to North Africa. Despite his fascinating beginnings, he fell on hard times towards the end of his life and was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave in 1682 Common Era. William Shakespeare, often referred to as the Bard, used the archetype of the fool in many of his works. In doing so, He continued the tradition that had been set centuries before, of a farcical man being the one a monarch would lean to for deep insight. This would often also be a person of lower standing who uses their intelligence to outwit a noble and elevate their station in life. It seems that humans have a natural predilection to empathise with the underdog, to root for the one that found their way using their wits and intelligence to win the day. Interestingly, this is around the same time that the tarot deck saw prominence. The very first card in this deck is famously the Fool, which represents beginner's luck, inexperience, improvisation, and faith in the future. When upright, the card represents innocence, originality, and spontaneity. While reversed, it means folly, naivety, and stupidity. I feel this encapsulates everything we've been talking about during this exploration. From the neolithic campfire to ancient China, Greece, Rome, and up into the present day, the idea of the entertainer has changed while keeping its core principles. This is, to create, to communicate, to share a part of ourselves, is to use our most important tool, our own intellect. For some, this has been a necessity when the cards fell as they may and one was not gifted physical prowess. This is why this archetype is found globally in almost every single culture. This is why Yu Meng was gifted the jester's privilege all that time ago, why Shakespeare included the Fool in his plays, and why we find charming cads like Indiana Jones and Star-Lord the most compelling of protagonists. Because of our subjective consciousnesses, we are all looking from the outside of society inwards. Because most of us aren't the quickest or the strongest, but we've all had one time when, pulled from divine inspiration, we have articulated a thought so precisely, we have surprised even ourselves. The fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool. Shakespeare's As You Like It, Act 5, Scene 1.